My daughter's dentist asked if we kept rope in our basement. Dr. Kimberly Ashford called my cell phone during my lunch break at the construction site where I worked as a project manager. I was eating a sandwich in my truck when her name appeared on the screen. My daughter Sophie had an appointment that morning for a routine cleaning, and my wife Vanessa had taken her before heading to her shift at the hospital. I answered expecting to hear about a cavity, or maybe a reminder about flossing. Instead, Dr. Ashford's voice came through tight and careful, each word measured. Mr. Garrett, I need to ask you something directly. Does your family keep rope stored in your basement? The question landed wrong, too specific and strange for a dentist to be asking. I set down my sandwich and stared through the windshield at the construction equipment moving across the site. I'm sorry, what? Why are you asking about rope? There was a pause that stretched too long, filled with the sound of her breathing and muffled voices in the background. I'd rather discuss this in person. Can you come to my office immediately? It's urgent. Her tone made my stomach drop. Something was very wrong. I told my foreman I had a family emergency and drove the 15 minutes to Dr. Ashford's office with my hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. The dental practice was in a strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service, a place Sophie had been going since she was 5 years old. I'd never had a single concern about Dr. Ashford or her staff. They were professional and kind, the kind of practice that gave kids stickers and made going to the dentist feel safe. I parked and walked through the front entrance where the receptionist looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. She gestured toward the back without her usual greeting. Dr. Ashford met me in the hallway outside an exam room. She was in her late 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a bun, and her face was pale. Mr. Garrett, thank you for coming so quickly. I need to show you something, and I need you to stay calm while I explain. She led me into an empty consultation room and closed the door. On the desk was a tablet displaying dental x-rays of Sophie's mouth. Dr. Ashford pointed to specific areas on the x-rays. These are images from today's exam. Sophie came in for her regular cleaning and I noticed some unusual marks on her wrists when she took off her jacket. When I asked her about them, she became very quiet and said she'd gotten them playing in the basement. She pulled up photos on the tablet showing Sophie's wrists with clear rope burns, red and raw against her pale skin. My vision tunneled. What are you saying? That someone tied up my daughter? Dr. Ashford's expression was controlled, but her voice shook slightly. The marks are consistent with ligature injuries, rope burns specifically based on the pattern and depth. I'm a mandated reporter, Mr. Garrett. When I see signs of potential abuse, I'm required by law to contact Child Protective Services. But I wanted to speak with you first because Sophie mentioned the basement specifically, and she mentioned rope. I need to understand what's happening in your home. The accusation hung in the air between us. She thought I was hurting my daughter. She thought my wife was hurting her. Someone was hurting her, and we were the obvious suspects. I would never hurt Sophie, neither would my wife. We don't keep rope in the basement. We don't have anything down there except storage boxes and the water heater. My voice came out louder than I intended and Dr. Ashford's posture stiffened. I understand this is difficult, but I've already made the call to CPS. They're sending someone to your home today to investigate. I'm also required to keep Sophie here until they arrive, or until I can release her to a parent who isn't under investigation. The words hit me in waves. Investigation. CPS. My daughter had rope burns and I had no explanation for them. I pulled out my phone and called Vanessa. She answered on the second ring, her voice cheerful. Hey, is everything okay? I told her what Dr. Ashford had shown me, about the marks on Sophie's wrists, about CPS being called. The line went silent for several seconds. Then, Vanessa's voice came back sharp and panicked. That's impossible. Sophie was fine this morning. She was fine when I dropped her off. Where did those marks come from? Dr. Ashford gestured for me to put the call on speaker. Mrs. Garrett, this is Dr. Ashford. I need to ask you directly. Has Sophie mentioned anything about being restrained or tied up? Has she said anything about the basement? Vanessa's breathing was audible through the phone. No. Nothing. Our basement is just storage. We barely go down there. Sophie definitely doesn't play down there. It's not finished, just concrete and boxes. Dr. Ashford made notes on a pad. I need both of you to understand the severity of this situation. Sophie has physical injuries that suggest she's been bound with rope. She specifically mentioned your basement when I asked about the marks. Child Protective Services will need to inspect your home and interview Sophie separately. Until they clear you, there are legal restrictions on your contact with her. I felt like the ground was disappearing beneath me. 20 minutes ago, I was eating lunch on a normal day. Now I was being investigated for child abuse based on injuries I knew nothing about. Can I see her? Can I talk to Sophie right now? Dr. Ashford shook her head. I can't allow that until CPS arrives. I'm sorry, but I have to follow protocol. Sophie is in the waiting room with my assistant. She's safe and calm, but any conversation between you needs to be supervised by the investigator. I wanted to argue, to demand to see my daughter, but the fear in Dr. Ashford's eyes stopped me. She genuinely believed Sophie was in danger. She was doing what she thought was right, even if it was destroying my family in the process. I sat down heavily in one of the consultation chairs. How long until CPS gets here? Dr. Ashford checked her phone. They said within the hour. I've already sent them the photos and x-rays. They're treating this as a priority case. Vanessa's voice came through the phone speaker. I'm leaving the hospital now. I'll meet you there. The call ended, and I sat in silence with Dr. Ashford, both of us waiting for authorities to arrive and pass judgment on whether I was a child abuser or a confused father. The CPS investigator arrived 40 minutes later. Her name was Patricia Reynolds, and she carried herself with the exhausted efficiency of someone who'd seen too much horror in too many homes. She spoke with Dr. Ashford privately for 10 minutes, reviewed the photos and x-rays, then asked to speak with me alone. We moved to a different consultation room, and she sat across from me with a notepad and recording device. Mr. Garrett, I'm going to record this conversation. You're not under arrest, and you're free to leave at any time, but I need to gather information about your home environment and your daughter's daily routine. She pressed record and asked me to state my name and address. Then she started asking questions. Did I have a criminal record? No. Had I ever been investigated by CPS before? No. Did I use physical discipline with Sophie? No. We used timeouts and took away privileges when needed. Did we have rope or cord in our home? I tried to think through every room, every closet. We might have some old extension cords in the garage, maybe some twine in a junk drawer, but nothing that would cause marks like that. Patricia made notes without looking up. Does Sophie have access to your basement? I explained that the basement was unfinished and we used it only for storage. Sophie knew she wasn't supposed to go down there alone because the stairs were steep and there was no railing. When was the last time you saw your daughter's wrists clearly? The question made me realize I couldn't remember. Sophie had been wearing long sleeves for the past week because the weather had turned cold. She could have had those marks for days, and I wouldn't have noticed. The thought made me sick. I don't know. Maybe a week? She's been wearing sweaters and hoodies. Patricia's expression didn't change, but she wrote something that looked significant. Has Sophie mentioned any adults in her life who make her uncomfortable? Teachers, coaches, family friends? I thought through everyone Sophie interacted with regularly. Her teacher, Mrs. Huang, at school. Her soccer coach, Tom Rafferty. Our neighbors, the Bishops, who had kids Sophie's age. No one comes to mind. She's never said anything about feeling uncomfortable with anyone. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from our work schedules to Sophie's behavior at home to whether we'd noticed any changes in her mood or appetite. Finally, Patricia turned off the recorder. Mr. Garrett, I'm going to need to inspect your home today. I'll also need to interview Sophie separately, and will likely need to do a forensic interview at the Child Advocacy Center. Your wife is arriving now, so I'll speak with her next. Then we'll all go to your house together. I stood up on legs that felt unsteady. Can I see Sophie now? Just for a minute? Patricia considered this. Brief contact only. No discussing the marks or what she told Dr. Ashford. Just let her know you're here and everything will be okay. She led me to the waiting room where Sophie sat in a chair too big for her 7-year-old frame, coloring in a book one of the staff had given her. When she saw me, her face lit up. Daddy! She jumped down and ran to me. I knelt and hugged her carefully, afraid to hold too tight, afraid to hurt her in any way. Hey, sweetheart. Mom's on her way and we're all going to go home together soon, okay? Sophie nodded against my shoulder. I pulled back and looked at her small face, searching for signs of fear or trauma or anything that would explain what was happening. She looked normal, happy even. How could she have rope burns on her wrists and look completely fine? Patricia stepped forward. Sophie, I'm Ms. Reynolds. I need to talk to your parents for a little while longer, and then I'd like to ask you some questions too. Is that okay? Sophie looked at me for confirmation, and I nodded even though every instinct was screaming to grab her and run. Okay, Sophie said quietly. She went back to her coloring while Patricia pulled me into the hallway. Mr. Garrett, I need you to understand something. The marks on your daughter's wrists are serious. They indicate she's been restrained, possibly multiple times based on the layering of the injuries. Whether that happened in your home or somewhere else, we need to find out immediately. Vanessa arrived 10 minutes later, still in her nursing scrubs, her face pale and her eyes red from crying during the drive. Patricia interviewed her separately, using the same questions she'd asked me. I sat in the waiting room with Sophie, pretending to help her color while my mind raced through possibilities. Could Sophie have gotten those marks at school? At a friend's house? Had something happened we didn't know about? The thought that someone had hurt my daughter while I was oblivious made me want to put my fist through a wall. After Vanessa's interview, Patricia gathered all of us together. We're going to your home now. I'll need to inspect the entire property, including the basement. Dr. Ashford will keep Sophie's medical records on file, and I'm opening a formal case. Depending on what I find at your house, there may be additional steps required. We drove in separate vehicles to our house on Maple Street, a modest 3-bedroom ranch we'd bought 5 years ago when Vanessa got her nursing job. Patricia followed in her state vehicle while Sophie rode with Vanessa, and I drove alone, my hands shaking on the wheel. The house looked exactly as we'd left it that morning. Dishes in the sink from breakfast, Sophie's backpack by the door, the living room scattered with her toys. Patricia walked through each room methodically, taking photos and notes. She opened closets and checked under beds. She examined our garage and photographed the extension cords and tools hanging on pegboards. Then she asked to see the basement. I led her to the door off the kitchen and flipped on the light. The wooden stairs descended into dimness that the single bulb barely penetrated. Patricia went down carefully, her phone's flashlight adding illumination. Vanessa and I followed while Sophie stayed upstairs, told to wait in the living room. The basement was exactly as I'd described it. Concrete floor, exposed pipes, cardboard boxes stacked against walls containing Christmas decorations and old clothes. The water heater hummed in the corner. Patricia examined everything, moving boxes and shining her light into corners. Then she stopped at the far wall. "Mr. Garrett, what's this?" She was pointing at something I'd walked past 1,000 times without really seeing. A metal eye bolt screwed into one of the floor joists, the kind you'd use to hang a heavy bag or secure something. I moved closer and stared at it. "I don't know. That's been there since we bought the house. The previous owners left it, I guess." Patricia took multiple photos from different angles. Then she moved her light along the floor beneath the eye bolt. There were marks in the dust, drag marks and disturbed areas that suggested something had been happening in this spot recently. My stomach turned over. "We don't use this space. We hardly ever come down here. I'm telling you, I don't know what those marks are from." Patricia stood up and brushed dust off her knees. "Mr. Garrett, I'm going to need to bring in a forensic team. The marks on your daughter's wrists combined with this eye bolt and the disturbance patterns suggest she may have been restrained in this basement. Until we determine what happened, I can't allow Sophie to remain in this home." The words felt like a physical blow. "You're taking her away?" Vanessa's voice broke. "You can't take our daughter. We haven't done anything wrong." Patricia's expression was firm, but not unkind. "I have a duty to ensure Sophie's safety. Right now, the evidence suggests she's been harmed in this home. Until the investigation is complete, she'll be placed in emergency foster care or with a relative if you have someone approved." I thought of my brother, living 3 states away, and Vanessa's mother, who was in a nursing home with dementia. We had no immediate family who could take Sophie. "How long will this investigation take?" Patricia headed back up the stairs. "That depends on what forensics finds and what Sophie tells us in her interview. It could be days or it could be weeks. I'm sorry, but I don't have a choice here. The evidence is concerning enough that I have to act." We emerged from the basement into the kitchen where Sophie was sitting at the table, drinking juice Vanessa had given her. She looked up with innocent eyes, unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. Patricia knelt beside Sophie's chair. "Sophie, I need you to come with me for a little while. We're going to a special place where people help kids, and they're going to ask you some questions. Your mom and dad can't come right now, but they'll see you again very soon." Sophie's face crumpled. "I want to stay with Mommy and Daddy." Vanessa started crying openly, and I felt my own tears burning. Patricia remained calm and professional. "I know this is scary, but it's just for a short time. You're going to stay with a very nice family who takes care of kids. They have toys and books, and you'll be safe there. Your parents love you very much, and they want you to cooperate with the people who are trying to help." Sophie looked at us for permission, and I nodded even though it felt like my heart was being ripped out. "It's okay, sweetheart. We'll get this sorted out and you'll be home before you know it. Just tell Ms. Reynolds the truth about everything, okay?" Sophie nodded slowly, tears running down her cheeks. Patricia helped her gather a few belongings and led her toward the door. Vanessa tried to hug Sophie goodbye, but Patricia gently intervened. "Limited contact until the investigation progresses. I'm sorry." We watched through the window as Patricia buckled Sophie into the back seat of her vehicle and drove away with our daughter. The house felt cavernous and wrong without her presence. Vanessa collapsed onto the couch, sobbing, and I stood in the kitchen trying to process what had just happened. Our daughter had rope burns we couldn't explain. There was evidence in our basement suggesting she'd been restrained there. CPS had taken her into protective custody, and we had no idea how any of this had happened. My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered and heard a man's voice I didn't recognize. "Mr. Garrett, this is Detective Raymond Cruz with the County Sheriff's Department. I've been assigned to investigate the allegations regarding your daughter. I need you and your wife to come to the station for formal interviews. Can you be here within the hour?" I looked at Vanessa, who'd heard the question, and nodded through her tears. "Yes, we'll be there." The sheriff's station was a low brick building downtown that I'd driven past hundreds of times without thinking about. Now I was walking through its doors as a potential suspect in child abuse. Detective Cruz met us in the lobby, a man in his early 50s with gray streaks in his dark hair and the weathered face of someone who'd seen humanity's worst. He led us to separate interview rooms without explanation. I sat alone in a small space with a table, 2 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner. Cruz entered with a folder and a recording device. "Mr. Garrett, this interview is being recorded. You're not under arrest, but you are being investigated for potential child abuse. You have the right to an attorney. Do you want to call one before we proceed?" I should have said yes. Every instinct said to protect myself legally, but I also knew that asking for a lawyer would make me look guilty, would slow down the process of getting Sophie back. "I don't need an attorney. I haven't done anything wrong." Cruz nodded and pressed record. He asked me to state my name and address, then launched into questions that covered the same ground Patricia had explored, but with more aggressive precision. "Walk me through a typical day in your household. Who wakes up first? What time does Sophie get up? Who gets her ready for school?" I described our routine. I woke up at 5:30 to be at the construction site by 7. Vanessa got Sophie ready and dropped her at school on her way to the hospital where she worked the day shift. Sophie went to after-school care until one of us picked her up around 6. We had dinner together, helped with homework, bath time, bed by 8:30. Normal suburban family life. And your basement? How often do you go down there? I admitted maybe once a month to grab holiday decorations or check on the water heater. It wasn't a space we used regularly. So, you're telling me Sophie could have been going down there without your knowledge? The question felt like a trap. The stairs are steep. We told her not to go down there alone. She's a good kid. She listens to rules. Cruz made notes. Good kids can still do things they're not supposed to. Or someone else could have taken her down there. Do you have anyone who comes to your house regularly? Handymen, cleaners, friends? I listed the few people who'd been in our home recently. The HVAC guy who serviced our furnace last month, our neighbor Dennis Bishop who borrowed tools sometimes, Vanessa's friend Karen from work who came over occasionally. Cruz wrote down every name. Tell me about Dennis Bishop. How well do you know him? I explained. Dennis lived 3 houses down with his wife and 2 kids. We weren't close friends, but we were neighborly. We'd had them over for a barbecue last summer. Has Dennis ever been in your basement? I tried to remember. Maybe. He borrowed a ladder once, and I think it was stored down there. I would have gone down and gotten it for him, though. I don't think he went down alone. Cruz's expression remained neutral. What about when you borrowed tools from him? Did you ever go into his basement? The question's direction became clear. He was building a map of who had access to whose home. Once or twice, maybe. He has a workshop down there where he does woodworking. Cruz leaned forward slightly. Does Dennis Bishop have any rope in his basement for his woodworking? The connection hit me like cold water. I don't know. I didn't pay attention to what supplies he had. Cruz pulled out photos of Sophie's wrists and laid them on the table. These injuries didn't happen from playing. Someone tied your daughter up, Mr. Garrett. Someone with access to rope and a space to do this without being interrupted. If it wasn't you, and it wasn't your wife, then who? I stared at the photos and felt rage building underneath my fear. Someone had hurt Sophie. Someone had put rope around her small wrists and caused those burns, and that someone might be walking around free while I sat in this interview room being treated like a criminal. I don't know who did this, but you need to find out because every minute you spend investigating me is time you're not spending finding whoever actually hurt my daughter. Cruz gathered the photos. We're investigating all possibilities. Your wife is being interviewed now. Forensics is processing your basement. We'll have answers soon. The interview lasted another 40 minutes before Cruz finally let me go, instructing me not to leave town and to remain available for follow-up questions. Vanessa was waiting in the lobby, her face ravaged by crying. We drove home in silence and walked into a house that felt empty and violated. The forensics team arrived an hour later, 3 technicians with equipment and evidence bags. They spent 3 hours in our basement, taking samples and photos and measurements. When they left, they'd removed several items including scrapings from the floor, dust samples, and close-up documentation of the eye bolt. That night, Vanessa and I lay in bed unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of events that had no logical explanation. Someone took her down there, Vanessa whispered. Someone hurt our baby in our own home, and we didn't know. The thought was intolerable. We'd failed to protect Sophie from something happening under our own roof. My phone rang at 2 o'clock in the morning. Detective Cruz. Mr. Garrett, we have preliminary results from the forensics team. The dust samples from your basement contain synthetic fibers consistent with rope. We also found what appear to be Sophie's fingerprints on the wall near the eye bolt, at a height suggesting she was standing and possibly reaching up. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. What does that mean? Cruz's voice was measured. It means Sophie was definitely in your basement recently, and there's physical evidence supporting her being restrained near that eye bolt. What we don't know yet is who took her down there and why. The investigation is ongoing. He hung up, and I relayed the information to Vanessa. We held each other and cried, mourning the loss of our daughter's safety and innocence. The next morning, Patricia called with news about Sophie's forensic interview. The Child Advocacy Center conducted a comprehensive interview using trained specialists. Sophie was very cooperative. She paused. Mr. Garrett, Sophie told the interviewer that a man took her to the basement. She said he told her it was a game and that she shouldn't tell anyone because it was their special secret. She described being tied up and left alone in the dark for periods of time. She said this happened multiple times over the past 2 weeks. My legs went weak. What man? Did she describe him? Patricia's voice was tight. She said he was tall, with dark hair. She called him the friend. When asked to clarify, she said he was her daddy's friend. The accusation shifted everything. Sophie thought this man was my friend, someone I'd brought into our home and into her life, someone I'd unknowingly given access to hurt her. I need you to come back to the station with photos of every adult male your daughter has had contact with in the past month. Friends, relatives, neighbors, co-workers, anyone who fits the description of tall with dark hair. I agreed, and started making a mental list as soon as we hung up. Dennis Bishop was tall with dark hair. So was the HVAC technician who'd serviced our furnace. And there was Greg Mallory, a guy from my construction crew who'd come over once to help me move furniture. I gathered every photo I could find, pulling images from social media and my phone's camera roll. Vanessa added names I'd forgotten, creating a comprehensive list of every possible person Sophie might have encountered. We drove to the station, and Detective Cruz spread the photos across a table in an interview room. They'd bring Sophie in to look at them through a one-way mirror, letting her identify the man without us being present to influence her. The wait was excruciating. We sat in a different room while Sophie was brought to the station with her foster parents and a victim advocate. Cruz came back 30 minutes later with an expression I couldn't read. Sophie identified someone from your photos. He turned his laptop around to show me which image she'd pointed to. My breath stopped. It was Dennis Bishop, our neighbor, the man I'd borrowed tools from, whose kids played with Sophie, who I'd considered a friendly acquaintance, if not a close friend. Sophie was very clear. She said this is the man who took her to the basement. She called him the friend because she'd heard you refer to him as your friend and neighbor. Cruz's voice was controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. Mr. Garrett, how often has Dennis Bishop been in your home? I tried to think through every interaction. I don't know. Maybe a dozen times over the past year. He'd come over to borrow tools or return things he'd borrowed. Sometimes he'd stop by if he saw me working in the yard. Cruz made notes. And your basement door, does it lock? I thought about the simple door off our kitchen with its basic handle. No, it's just a regular door. Anyone in the house could open it. The investigation shifted focus immediately. Detective Cruz obtained a warrant for Dennis Bishop's home and arrived there with multiple officers at 6 a.m. I learned about it later from news reports and Cruz's follow-up call. They'd found rope in Dennis's basement workshop, multiple types in different thicknesses. They'd also found a notebook containing handwritten entries that documented his access to our home, dates and times when he'd borrowed tools or returned items, observations about our schedules and Sophie's routine. The notebook was methodical and disturbing, the work of someone planning his opportunities carefully. Dennis Bishop was arrested and charged with child abuse, kidnapping, and unlawful restraint. His wife claimed she had no knowledge of what he'd been doing and moved out with their children the same day. The case became public, and our neighborhood exploded with fear and anger. Parents who'd trusted Dennis Bishop with their children now questioned every interaction. The Bishop's house remained empty, a crime scene that investigators continued to process for evidence. Patricia called to tell us Sophie could come home now that a suspect had been arrested, and evidence proved we weren't involved. Vanessa and I drove to the foster home where Sophie had spent 3 days living with strangers. She ran to us when we arrived, and we held her for a long time in the foster family's living room. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the game, Sophie said, her small voice muffled against Vanessa's shoulder. He said it was supposed to be secret. He said I'd get in trouble if I told. I knelt down to meet her eyes. Sweetheart, you're not in trouble. You did nothing wrong. Mr. Bishop did very bad things, and he's the only one who should have gotten in trouble. When someone tells you to keep secrets from Mommy and Daddy, that's when you need to tell us right away, especially if those secrets make you uncomfortable. Sophie nodded seriously. The lady at the special place said that too. She said good secrets are things like birthday surprises, but bad secrets are when people do things that hurt you or scare you. We took her home and tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy while the investigation continued. Detective Cruz called me a week later with an update I wasn't prepared for. Mr. Garrett, Dennis Bishop is talking. He wants a plea deal in exchange for information about other victims. My stomach dropped. Other victims? You mean Sophie wasn't the only one? Cruz's voice was grim. He's admitted to targeting at least 3 other children in your neighborhood over the past year. He used the same method, gaining access to homes through neighborly interactions, then taking the children to isolated spaces when parents weren't watching. Your basement was just one location. He has others. The news devastated the community. 3 other families came forward when detectives contacted them, parents who'd noticed behavioral changes in their children but hadn't connected them to Dennis Bishop, kids who'd become afraid of basements or developed anxiety about being alone. Signs that had been dismissed as normal childhood fears now revealed themselves as trauma responses. The case expanded to include multiple charges across multiple victims. Dennis Bishop eventually accepted a plea deal that gave him 30 years in prison without possibility of parole. The alternative was going to trial where he'd face life sentences if convicted on all counts. The day of his sentencing, Vanessa and I sat in the courtroom with the other families whose children Dennis had hurt. The judge allowed victim impact statements, and I stood at the podium trying to find words adequate to describe what he'd done to Sophie, to us, to our sense of safety in our own home. My daughter was 7 years old when you decided to use her for your twisted games. You were our neighbor. We trusted you. We welcomed you into our lives, and you repaid that trust by traumatizing our child in a space where she should have felt completely safe. The marks on her wrists will heal. The fear she feels about basements and strangers and secrets will take years to overcome. You didn't just hurt Sophie that day in our basement. You stole her innocence and her trust in adults who are supposed to protect children. I hope 30 years gives you time to understand the magnitude of what you've done to these families. The judge sentenced Dennis Bishop to the maximum allowed under the plea agreement. He was led away without looking at any of us. Sophie started therapy the week after Dennis's arrest, working with a specialist in childhood trauma. The therapist explained that Sophie's recovery would be a long process, that the fear and anxiety would surface in unexpected ways as she processed what had happened. She had nightmares about basements and being trapped. She became clingy and didn't want to be alone in any room. She asked constant questions about who was coming to our house and whether they were safe. We installed new locks on every door, including the basement. We finished the basement space with drywall and proper lighting, transforming it from a dark storage area into a bright playroom where Sophie could see there were no shadows to hide threats. We had a security system installed with cameras covering every entrance. We did everything we could think of to help Sophie feel safe again. The other families in the neighborhood did similar things, transforming homes and routines to address the fear Dennis Bishop had planted. Months passed and gradually Sophie's nightmares became less frequent. She laughed more easily and played with less hesitation. The rope burns on her wrists faded to thin white lines that would probably disappear completely as she grew. The psychological scars would take longer. A year after Dennis's arrest, Dr. Kimberly Ashford called to check on Sophie. "I think about her often," she said. "I'm so sorry you all had to go through that investigation before we found out the truth, but I hope you understand I had to report what I saw. Those marks were serious and Sophie mentioned your basement. I couldn't ignore that. I told her I understood, and that her reporting had ultimately led to Dennis Bishop being caught. If she hadn't noticed those marks and asked the questions, he might still be out there hurting children." "How is Sophie doing now?" Dr. Ashford asked. I looked across the living room where Sophie was drawing pictures with Vanessa. She was 8 now, a year older and wiser than she should have had to become. "She's healing. We're all healing. Some days are harder than others, but we're getting through it together." Dr. Ashford thanked me for the update and hung up. That evening, Sophie asked if she could talk to me about something serious. We sat on her bed with her favorite stuffed animals surrounding us. "Daddy, I want to help other kids who have bad things happen to them. The lady at the special place, she made me feel safe. I want to do that when I grow up." The fact that Sophie could take her trauma and transform it into purpose made my chest tight with pride and grief. She'd survived something no child should experience and was already thinking about how to help others. "That's a wonderful goal, sweetheart. The world needs more people who help kids feel safe." She nodded seriously. "And Daddy, thank you for believing me. Even when you didn't understand what was happening, you never made me feel bad about the marks. You just wanted to make it better." I held her close and promised myself again that I'd spend the rest of my life making sure she felt protected and valued. Dennis Bishop had tried to destroy her sense of safety, but he'd failed. Sophie was stronger than the trauma he'd inflicted. 2 years after the sentencing, Vanessa and I attended a community meeting organized by the families Dennis had victimized. We'd formed a support group that met monthly, sharing strategies for helping our children recover and advocating for better safeguards to protect kids from predators hiding in plain sight. We pushed for legislation requiring background checks for anyone volunteering with children, for mandatory training on recognizing grooming behaviors, for resources to help parents identify when something was wrong. Some of our proposals became local ordinances, others gained traction at the state level. It wasn't enough to undo what had happened to our children, but it might prevent future children from experiencing the same horror. Sophie thrived despite the trauma. She excelled in school and made friends and rediscovered the joy that Dennis Bishop had temporarily stolen. The rope burns on her wrists disappeared completely, leaving only the memories we helped her process through continued therapy and unwavering support. On her 10th birthday, Sophie asked if we could finally talk about what happened in the basement without everyone treating it like it was too scary to discuss. We sat together as a family, and she told us details she'd been protecting us from, things the therapist had helped her understand and articulate. It was painful to hear but necessary. She needed to know we could handle her truth without falling apart. That night, after Sophie went to bed, Vanessa and I stood in our finished basement, now a bright space filled with toys and laughter. When Dr. Ashford asked about rope in our basement, I thought our lives were ending, I said quietly. In a way they did. But we built something new from the wreckage, something stronger. Vanessa took my hand. Sophie built it. We just followed her lead. She was right. Our daughter had faced a monster and survived, and her courage had given us permission to heal alongside her. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.